Today's Farbrengen lasted for almost 5 hours. Really, to relate that many inyonim, which the Rebbe went through in these 5 hours, and do it all in 1 hour, is not easy. But I'm going to try to the best of my ability. We should at least touch a little bit of every inyan which was spoken throughout the Farbrengen. The Rebbe began the Farbrengen that today is Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh. Both inyanim coming together. And on one hand, Shabbos is something which we have every week, and it's something which really we are used to it, and we don't make no special issue of Shabbos. Rosh Chodesh as well is also something which we celebrate every month. Every month there's an inyan of Rosh Chodesh. The fact that Rosh Chodesh should fall out to be on a Shabbos, one may say, is also not that special. Why? Because if we look carefully, we will notice that throughout the year, at least every 6 months or so, we have a Rosh Chodesh that falls out to be on a Shabbos. So the fact that we have a combination of Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh both falling out on the same day, one may say is not of a great thing, and therefore it does not deserve any special attention. So the Rebbe compared it that we find what the Alter Rebbe writes in the Siddur. We know there are various writings from the Alter Rebbe. There's what the Alter Rebbe writes in Chassidus and another Sforim of the Alter Rebbe. However, what the Alter Rebbe writes in his Siddur, this in itself is an indication that this is something which is of equal significance to everyone. Otherwise, it wouldn't be written in the Siddur. The Rebbe stressed, not only does one have to be bar mitzvah to have a shaykhis to inyanim that are written in the Siddur, even prior to that, when he's a child, and a child that can read Siddur and has access to Siddur and knows what a Siddur is and makes use of a Siddur, memela all the inserts which the Alter Rebbe put into the Nusach HaTfilah, all the Hagoyas which the Alter Rebbe put into the Siddur have a shaykhis to each and every person, even youngsters as well. So the Alter Rebbe describes, right in the Siddur, right before Moed Ani, the Alter Rebbe describes how a person has to feel when he rises every morning. And the Alter Rebbe explains that a person has to imagine how Shivisi Hashem L'Negdi Samid, how the Rebishter is constantly in front of him, and as he wakes up in the morning, as he opens his eyes there in the morning, he has the Rebishter next to him. And this is something that happens every single morning. Because every single morning when we rise, we have the same minyan that the Rebishter is mamish next to us as we rise every morning. So just like we cannot underestimate this type of an inyan and say, we have it every day. What type of greatness is it? Usually we know when a person has something that doesn't come that often, he pays a special attention to it. However, when we get used to something and becomes like a Helgel Nasa Teva and Teva Sheni, we know we have this thing daily, so we don't make much of an issue about it. So the same thing one may say, benegay to this as well. Every day, the Rebishter is stuck next to him, but this is something which he has daily. So Mamela, it's something that he has daily, so it doesn't deserve a special attention. However, it is definitely not so. As we see from the words of the Alter Rebbe, that the Alter Rebbe stresses that this is something of great importance, how the person is supposed to imagine this is, even before he gieses Negelwasser, before he even has a chance to recite Moed Ani. The minute the Yid opens his eyes every morning, there he has the Rebishter standing right next to him. HaKadosh Baruch Hu B'chvod B'yatzma is next to each and every Yid as he rises every morning. Same thing the Rebbe went on. Benegei Shabbos. And Benegei the combination of Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh. Though we may think that these are something Yom V'Layla Lo Yishbaisu, it's something which is a routine. We know that there's a system of days, and at the end of every week comes a Shabbos. As well, there's a system of a month, and at the end of every monthly cycle, there we have Rosh Chodesh. So Mamela, one will play it down and say it doesn't have the proper Shivas. So here it comes, Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, and both come together, and to serve as a reminder that we have to pay the proper attention to both of these inyanim, and not say, it's inyanim that are bypassing, and we have them constantly. Memela, these are inyanim that do not deserve any special attention. It is definitely not so. And on the other hand, when we give these inyanim the attention has to be a proper one, as it's supposed to be accordingly, al pi Torah, al pi Shulchan Aruch, and al pi halacha, as it's required from a Yid. Rabbi brought an example. One will say, when he wakes up in the morning, here the Alter Rebbe tells us how the Rebishter is right next to every Yid, as he rises in the morning. So the proper thing for him to do in the morning when he rises would be right away he should start learning an in-depth Inyan Chassidus. Because Chassidus tells us about the greatness of the Rabbeinu Shalom, and here he's rising, he has the Rabbeinu Shalom right next to him. It would be only proper that at this time he should begin learning Chassidus. However, definitely this is not so. First the Yid, as he rises, he has to gieß Negelwasser. After he gießes Negelwasser, prior to that he says Moidani. Then he has to gieß Negelwasser. After Negelwasser, even saying he can't jump right away to Birchas HaTorah either. We know we have to say Birchas HaTorah before we learn Torah, and actually before we learn Chassidus as well, we have to say Birchas HaTorah. So one cannot jump over Birchas HaShachar and jump right away to Birchas HaTorah with a thirst and saying, the Rebishter is next to him, and if the Rebishter is next to him, he wants to learn Chassidus, which this will give him a proper understanding in the greatness of the Rabbeinu Shalom. So the truth is not so. This is not the proper attitude and the proper Seder Hayom, how a Yid is supposed to go on. Because before Birchas HaTorah, we have what we say Birchas HaShachar, 18 brachas that come prior to Birchas HaTorah. Erst after Yid said these brachas, and afterwards he said Birchas HaTorah. Then, if he wants to go ahead and get involved in learning Chassidus, which will give him a proper understanding of Gadlus HaBorah, then he can go ahead and do it. Or if he wants to do it after davening, as the Seder goes with Beis HaKnesses, LeBeis HaMedrash, it's again a proper time for learning. However, what we see from this is that every Inyan has its proper time, and every Inyan has to be treated accordingly. And this is what we have this year, that we have in the month of Iyar. We have Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh combined. And here the Rebbe referred also to a story which the Rebbe also told, more in detail the Rebbe told it before Pesach, in the second Farbrengen of Yud Aleph Nisan, that the Maggid, the Mizritcher Maggid, had a friend, Chava. They were very closely associated, they were Chaverim, they were learning together, and then they parted for a longer period of time. The Mizritcher Maggid became the Maggid of Mizritch, and his friend traveled elsewhere, and he was still a great giant in Torah and a great Eved Hashem. However, after a long period passed, he again met with the Maggid. And here he realized that the Maggid is davening much longer than he is davening. The Maggid's davening takes much longer, and he gets finished much earlier with the davening. So, afterwards, he was involved in a conversation with the Maggid. He tells him, no, after all, we are Chaverim. We were raised together, and we received training from the same Svarim and from the same Rebbes. And I understand as well as you the greatness of davening, but at the same time, I make davening in a much faster than you make davening. What takes you so long in davening? I mean, we could imagine that the Maggid Chava, who asked him this question, also didn't daven chapedike davening. He davened the proper davening as tefillah is required to be. However, the Maggid was really marich b'tefillah. So he questioned his Chava, the Maggid, why does davening take you so long? So the Maggid asked him back, tell me, how do you support yourself? How do you earn a living? So his Chava told him that he sits and learns, and his wife operates a little shop. And from the earnings, from whatever the merchandise that his wife sells, from this day, this provides a living for him and the family. However, as the custom would be in those days, he lived in a small city. In a small city, it wasn't easy to have access to get this merchandise. So once every couple of months, he would travel to a major city, to a major point, and do the shopping, and he would bring it back, and for the next couple of weeks or months, his wife would have what to sell. And this is something which they kept on doing on a procedure. Every couple of months, he would go and get the schayra, the merchandise, at a main city, one of the larger cities, and he would bring back for his wife to have what to sell. So the Maggid tells him, I want to ask you something. Why do you have to really go and travel and be wandering on the road? Naturally, we know that when a person is wandering, he cannot learn properly, he cannot daven properly. Haderech mima'etes, when a person is in the way, it's not easy for him to concentrate as far as Torah, as far as Tefillah. Why can't you do it something easier? Why can't you imagine, as you are traveling to the big city, go through all this in frame of mind and imagination. Imagine that you're traveling to the big city. Imagine that you're buying the merchandise. Imagine that you got it and you're traveling back. And here you're coming back with a whole load of merchandise, which would be enough for your wife to sell for the next couple of months. So he says, told the Maggid, how can you say a thing like that? I'll be missing the main thing. I'll be missing the schreire. Imagination is something which is very good and very fine. However, at the same token, I'll be missing physically the merchandise. And out of imagination, I cannot get hold of the merchandise. I really have to go and travel and be there. And the only way I could have the merchandise is if I'm there physically. Otherwise, I can't have it. Adam Maggid tells him the same thing is in Avodas Hashem when we're talking B'negei Tefillah. Tefillah is various levels. So we know Chassidus explains the whole union of Tefillah. Tefillah is a sulam mutzav arza. It's like a ladder. And just like a ladder has various steps, the same thing is the sulam hatfilah. A person keeps on going higher and higher as he gets involved really in davening. So the Maggid told him the same thing. When we're davening, we can't go through these spiritual elevations just in a sense of imagination. If I was to do it in a format of imagination, then I could go through it much faster. However, being that it has to be done physically, we really, in actuality, have to have the schreire. We have to have the merchandise. Here the Maggid was referring to the spiritual merchandise. We really have to have it. This takes much longer. And in order to really get the schreire, it's not enough to go through some sort of a fantasy, some sort of an imagination. We really have to go there and go through every spiritual step. And by doing this, this is how we can go through the proper requirement of tefillah. This is how the Maggid responded to his chaver b'negei tefillah. Rebbe Firda is the same thing in b'negei all the inyanim which we are talking about. It's not just that we're talking about inyanim and we have to have access of these inyanim in a format of an imagination. We really have to go through and live through all these inyanim, as the Baal Shem Tov keeps on stressing that everything that a yid gets involved with, every union that a yid hears is a hira, and Avodas Hashem has to take a lesson out of it in servicing the Reibishter. The same thing, all these inyanim, we really have to do it in actuality. Specifically, does Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, the combination of Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, have a very strong, it's very meaningful, the way it is this month, because this year it's a combination of Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh, and the Rosh Chodesh of what month? Of the month of Iyar. And as the Rebbe spoke last week, Ba'arichos, the month of Iyar stands for something, abbreviates Avram, Yitzchak, Yankev, and Rachel, which as Chassidus explained in Kabbalah and explained in Chassidus, this is the Daled Raglei HaMerkava, which the idea of a Merkava means, as the Alter Rebbe explains right away in the beginning of Tanya, a Merkava calls for a total bittul to the Roichev. The same thing, the idea, the demand of this month is, it calls for a total bittul, a total dedication to Avodas Hashem. And the Rebbe added on, we have something special in the month of Iyar, which we do not have in any other month. Other months have various Yom Tov and various mitzvahs. However, here in this month, we have a mitzvah that we fulfill each and every day of the month. Mitzvah of Sfiras Hayim. And it's the same mitzvah, doesn't differ any day differently than the other day. The same mitzvah, fulfilling every single day of the month. And this is something special which we do not have in any other month. An opportunity that every day should be blessed with a special mitzvah to fulfill on that day. And also the fact that the mitzvah is the same mitzvah, this also shows the idea of bittul. In other words, it's a total giveaway, not a one day it's one Indian, one day it's another Indian. It's a total giveaway, the total expression of Merkava. This is expressed in this month of the month of Iyar. Together with being it the month of Iyar, it is also the parsha of Tazria-Metzora. Many years, Tazria can fall out by itself. However, this year, both Sedras come combined, Tazria and Metzora. What's the pshat Tazria? Tazria is Meloshon Zera. When one plants, what's the pshat he plants? He puts in one seed or a few seeds, puts it in. However, when he's putting in these couple of seeds, his hopes are that it shouldn't remain just with these couple of seeds. His hopes are that it should grow a far much more amount as he's putting the seeds into the ground. He hopes that the result should be by far more. The very same is in the spiritual sense. There's an inyan of Ezriya beruchnias, a spiritual growing, and a spiritual planting. However, when we plant spiritually, we hope as well that the results will be that the growth, the spiritual fruit that will be growing as a result of this planting will be growing in a tremendous amount, in a tremendous abundance, by far much more than we are investing in the planting. And from Tazria we go to Tazria-Metzora, and when we see right away in the beginning of Rashi, the Sedra begins, and Rashi quotes the beginning of the Sedra as well. Zois tiyeh Tazria-Metzora. What's the pshat? Zois tiyeh. Zois tiyeh, the pshat, this will be so. Zois tiyeh Tazria-Metzora. So Rabbi added on, the addition of Parshas Metzora being combined with Parshas Tazria stresses that this will be brought into a reality. Zois tiyeh, it will be so. Not only is it a wish or a lesson that we are instructed that it should be this union of the spiritual planting that should bring about tremendous results in the growth, by far much more than we are investing in the planting. But the Torah is promising us, this is what we have this year in addition, that Tazria-Metzora go together. The Rebbe is promising, Zois tiyeh Teiras. This will be so in a reality that the Zriya will be such, it will be such a planting that will bring about tremendous results in a spiritual sense, a tremendous amount of growth, the fruit that will be coming out of this Aveda which we are demanded to do in the month of Iyar in general, and particularly in this day when Shabbos and Rosh Chodesh come as a combination.
Do you really compare to a neshama coming down to the earth?
Don't recall. Of course, in these couple of sichas, the Rebbe also stressed the importance of being mispalel for Geula. That our main inyan is, what is the whole inyan of Golus, especially the level of Golus we are into now, that we are constantly hoping and praying that the Rebbe should take us out of Golus. And here the Rebbe criticized very strongly that there are some that claim that they can learn Torah and have a Hatzlacha in Torah, and at the same time their hopes and prayers for Geula are not going to be wholeheartedly. They say every day in davening, a Semach David Avdecha Meheras Atzmiach, which we recite 3 times a day in davening, whereby we're asking for the Rebbe to send us the Geula Shleima, as well as other areas in Tefillah where we constantly refer to the Rebbe begging for Geula. When it comes to these parts of Tefillah, they say it, the Rebbe used the expression, min asofa lachutz, just very outsidedly, without any enthusiasm, without any kavanah, without any proper attention to it. So the Rebbe added on that when our attitude to Geula is such, then we cannot even have a proper Hatzlacha in Torah. And especially when we want to learn Torah in a sense of Lasuke Shmaitzes Alibe de Hilchase, to be able to paskin halachas properly, and one will approach it with an attitude that the Benegei and Yonim of Geula, that's secondary, and that's not something which is of extreme importance and very major and very primary. Says then even the Hatzlacha in Torah will not be a proper Hatzlacha as it should be as far as Hatzlacha in Torah. Because the inyan of Geula is something which is major and of extreme importance by Yidden, especially nowadays. And the Rebbe kept on stressing in previous Farbrengens that the Avodah of us nowadays is to bring Mashiach. That's why we are so demanding, the inyan of we want Mashiach now, we're so much demanding for and stressing so much the importance of doing inyanim, which will hasten the Geula, because this is the Tzav Hashah of our generation. It is mainly to bring to the accomplishment of the coming of Mashiach. Later in the Farbrengen, as usual, the Rebbe learned the Rashi in this week's Sedra, as well as explained the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, as well as spoke Behemshech to a Rashi in Pasha Shmini as well, which the Rebbe spoke about last week, and also in the Achim Shel Pesach Dike Farbrengen, about the conversation which was taking place in Pasha Shmini between Moshe and Aaron, if they were allowed to eat the korbanos, b'shas they were aninim. They had a din of an oinon. An oinon is the day somebody loses a relative. Before Kvura, there's a special halacha, it's considered an oinon. So being that was the day that Nadav and Avihu passed away, so Aaron had a halachic identification of an oinon, so the question aroused whether he was allowed to eat the korbanos or not. And as discussed previously, and we refer back to Pasha Shmini, so there is an expression in the Mechilta. Rashi doesn't bring this expression. However, in the Mechilta there is this expression, that Aaron tried to convince Moshe, explaining to him that he's not allowed to eat the korbanos. Why? He told him, Kal v'chomer mi meiser hakal. let us make a kal v'chayma from Meiser. Meiser is much easier than a korban. It doesn't carry the halachic restrictions which a korban does. And still we know that Meiser, it is forbidden to eat when one is in the position of aninus. Where do we find this? This we find in Pashas Kisava, in Chumash Dvorim. When a Yid brings Bikurim, that's when he expresses himself, Lo yachalti mimenu ba'oini. He didn't eat from the Bikurim or from Meiser when he was in the position of being an oina. So Amela Aaron tried to convince Moshe, Madach Meiser, which is easy. It doesn't have all the halachic restrictions of a korban. One is not allowed to eat it when he's in the position of an oina, and alachas kama v'kama, a korban, which is much more stricter than Meiser. One is definitely not allowed to eat it when he's in the position of aninus. Until we read finally in Chumash that Moshe gave in to Aaron, and Vayishma, Pasuk uses the expression, Vayishma Moshe Vayitav B'yeina. Moshe listened to what Aaron said, and he agreed to Aaron. The Rebbe explained today that Al-Pi Halacha, actually Moshe knew about it as well also. What's the pshat? Moshe told Aaron, told Moshe a kal v'chayma from Meiser HaKal. I mean, the one that taught Torah was Moshe, was the one that related Torah to Aaron. So if Aaron knew it, Moshe definitely knew it. However, where is this inyan discussed? This is discussed in Pashas Devarim. Until then, one may say on the other hand, maybe it wasn't known yet. When did the Rebbe tell Yidden that Meiser, it is forbidden to eat when one is in the position of being an Einon? First in Pashas Devarim. Here we are in Chumash Vayikra. However, Rebbe said we can refer, there's an opinion amongst Tanaim that everything was already related to Moshe Rabbeinu Misinai. It may have not been put into writing until many years later into Chumash Devarim. However, the entire Torah, Kloveseo, Proteseo, all the general rules and all the details, everything was related to Moshe from Sinai. Memela, it is something which Moshe knew about it, and taught it to Aaron, and for some reason it was that Aaron was the one that alerted Moshe back on it again. Rebbe said today that perhaps we can say that the Geder of this halacha, and Rashi Taka doesn't bring it, but the Mechilta does bring it, the Geder of this halacha at that time had the taikef, it had the effect of Torah Shebal Peh, of oral law. It did not carry the weight of something that is mentioned in Torah Shebiksav. Why? Because in Torah Shebiksav it first came years later. Years later it was entered into Chumash Devarim. It was taken known earlier because everything was taught to Moshe Rabbeinu as of Har Sinai. However, until it was put into writing, it may have had a din, not of Torah Shebiksav, but may have had a din of Torah Shebal Peh. As we are at this inyanim, the Rebbe said, being that we are in the days of the month of Iyar, and Iyar we celebrate Lag B'omer, there's another type of a similar shaila which he would like to mention. The Rebbe said that in his city as of a child, he remembers that it was a custom in his shtetl on Lag B'omer to eat boksa. Why? Because we read in the Zohar that Rabbi Lezer and Reb Shimon and Rashbi, and his son Rabbi Lezer, they were in a cave for 12 or 13 years, and they didn't have what to eat. And the Rebbe performed a miracle that a boksa tree grew up right in front of the outside of their cave, and that is what they were able to sustain themselves for throughout all the years that they were in the cave. Memela, was the Rebbe says the fruit was not seen throughout the entire year. Only on Lag B'omer, that's when it came around, and that's when he remembers as a child that the boksa would be eaten on Lag B'omer. And this was significant because to remind on the boksa tree which grew right outside of the cave of Rashbi. However, the Rebbe says the question arises, al pi halacha. We know that the first couple of years, the first 3 years, the fruits that grow on a tree have a din of orla. This particular tree was not a natural grown tree. This was something which we may use the expression Ma'aseh Nisem. It's the result of a nes, it's the result of a miracle. The Rebbe says it's brought in Sfarim that it takes tens and tens of years for a boksa tree to grow up. Memela here, a boksa tree grew right away because Rashbi and his son Rabbi Lezer needed food. So the Rebbe made this nes. However, the question arises on something which is created by a nes, are all the halachic restrictions of orla and Chumas Maisres. But here primarily the shaila is Benegeya orla. Was orla applicable on this tree or wasn't it? Talking about this, the Rebbe raised another question. It says that in the Medrash we are told that the Yidden, while traveling in the Midbar, they had the Be'era Shel Miriam with them, the well of Miriam, which just was supplying water for all of Klal Yisrael. The Medrash tells us that all around the Be'era Shel Miriam, all around this well, there were various fruits and vegetables that were growing. The Rebbe made a nest, and fruits and vegetables grew around this well. And Yidden were able to take these fruits and vegetables in addition to the mun, to the lechem and hashamayim, which the Yidden had. The Rebbe added this miracle as well. So the question also arises, if all halachic inyanim which apply b'negeya fruits and vegetables, if this applied b'negeya to these fruits and vegetables that grew around Miriam's well or not. What's the basis of the question? The basis of the question is because this wasn't a natural growth. This is something which happened through a nest. And something that happens through a nest is a shayla if the inyanim, if the halachas that go on b'negeya inyanim tiviyim, as if it would grow naturally it would have all the halachic restrictions, but being that this grew by miracle, so it's a question which is discussed in Poskim if the halachic restrictions apply here or don't they. The Rebbe also spoke that he's a little bit surprised, he said, that we're already more than a week after Pesach, and there was no gathering of Tzivos Hashem since Pesach here. The Rebbe stressed again the greatness of the Tzivos Hashem gatherings. The Rebbe says the real importance, how great the accomplishments of youngsters are. We track back to the year 1927, Tafresh Pei Zayin. That was the year when the Frierdiker Rebbe was arrested. And in that year, the Frierdiker Rebbe said Ma'amorim, where he stressed very much the importance of Mipi Oilelim V'Yoinkim Yesadita Ois, how Oilelim V'Yoinkim, meaning youngsters, give strength and aid and assistance to Klal Yisrael. The Meir Rebbe says the Indian of Tzivos Hashem is nothing new. It's something which tracks back how the Frierdiker Rebbe has stressed it in 1927. The Rebbe says he constantly keeps on stressing the great importance of Tzivos Hashem and constantly keeps on alerting us to make gatherings of children, and that children should congregate and should be stressed the greatness of and the importance of what a child can accomplish and the great accomplishment what children can accomplish. However, the Rebbe says it seems that he constantly has to keep on reminding, and it's not even enough a chazakah of 3 times. Normally we know that there's an Indian of a chazakah of 3 times. He says 3 times 3 also doesn't help, because he's spoken about it that many times, and the Rebbe says each time he speaks about it, the sikha that he speaks is given into him, and the Rebbe says he goes over it and reviews it, and then it's published. He says, but what happens is once it's published, it's put on the shelf, nothing more. And then the next time he gets an occasion to speak to children, and it's again, we go through the same procedure again, and again it's put on the shelf. So here the Rebbe seems like he's very unsatisfied that these are days of great importance, days after Pesach, days of Yemei HaSfirah, and nothing was done to gather children and congregate children and make a gathering of Tzivos Hashem. The Rebbe says it's the time now to talk about doing something with children, b'negei Lag Ba'ima. The Rebbe says really, in reality, he's talking about the greatness of Lag Ba'ima since the beginning of the year. Because at the beginning of the year, the Rebbe keeps on stressing that this year Rosh Hashanah came out to be on a Tuesday, which is a Yom Shehukfal B'Kitoyev. Shmini Atzeres, the same, on a Yom Shehukfal B'Kitoyev. Chav Cheshvan, 20 days in the month of Cheshvan, which is the birthday of the Rebbe Rashab, also on a Tuesday. Yutes Kislev, which is Rosh Hashanah LaChasidus, also came out on a Tuesday this year, as well as Purim came out on a Tuesday, and Lag Ba'ima will also be on a Tuesday, which is a Yom Shehukfal B'Kitoyev. So this is a day again, it's a special significance, B'chlal the day of Lag Ba'ima, and particularly the fact that it falls out to be on a Tuesday. So the Rebbe always keeps on stressing the greatness of Tuesday. It's a Yom Shehukfal B'Kitoyev. Kitoyev, good, is mentioned twice in the creation of Tuesday, in Chumash Bereishis. And the Gemara tells us that it's a Yom Shehukfal B'Kitoyev, Toiv LaShamayim v'Toiv LaBriyos. It stands for excelling in Toiv and good, and in Yonei Shamayim, in spiritual things, as well as in Yonei excelling in Toiv and in Yonei Briyos, meaning from one person to another. Rebbe said our problem is that we've got involved and we got used to other things. The Rebbe again stressed that we have turned it into a habit that we cannot start the day without a glass of juice. And this glass of juice has to come even before davening. And he says it really became part of us. Part of us to such an extent that when a person will go to a doctor, the doctor will tell him naturally he needs it. Why does he need it? Because he's gotten himself used to it. That's how he got his system used to, that he cannot start his day unless he has a cup of juice. Here the Rebbe referred again to the Ma'aseh which he spoke, related last week, the expression of the Rebbe Rashab, how Rebbe Rashab once expressed himself that he never saw a head in kalashes. Just to go over it briefly, it was one of the, mentioned it last week at length, it was one of the great close disciples and Hasidim of the Rebbe Rashab. It was great in learning, understanding of Nigla and Hasidus, and he went into a rubber business, kalashes business. And the Rebbe Rashab was very unsatisfied about it. So he expressed himself that he already saw feet in kalashes. That's something usual, something common. However, to see a head in kalashes, because this person put his head into developing his kalashes business, this the Rebbe Rashab said is something very unusual. The Rebbe in last week's Farbrengen, and mentioned it today again, he says that there's something further from a person, further yet than kalashes, and that is carpeting. And he says to go ahead and put a head in carpeting, this is something yet more unusual. However, here we're talking about people who are, says the Rebbe criticized very strongly that we've gotten ourselves into a habit that we cannot start the day, we cannot go ahead to daven even. And he says now, once a person has got himself into that system, al pidin, he's allowed to go ahead and drink the cup of juice before davening, because otherwise it will be harmful to his health. And here the Rebbe referred to a famous expression from one of the Rabbeim, but one of the Rabbeim expressed himself that it's better to eat because of davening rather than to daven because of eating. In other words, one that wouldn't eat or drink something before davening, and Mela he'll feel his body will feel that he needs it. Mela he'll be hungry or he'll feel a weakness, so he's going to daven faster. So what's going to happen is he's davening because of eating, and this is something which is definitely not proper. However, it's better to eat because of davening. In other words, one will eat something before davening, so he's eating because of davening, eating or drinking, so he has koyach to daven properly without any interference of hunger or weakness or so and so forth, and he can go through the davening properly. The Rebbe again alerted very much about the importance of all the miftzoyim in general, and particularly in Inyan Shehazman Grama, something which is very important this time of the year. Firstly, to see to it that each and every Yid has a letter in the Sefer Torah which are being written for Klal Yisrael. And the Rebbe reminded us today again about the Sefer Torah Liyalda Yisrael, the Sefer Torah for Jewish children that is being written, the second Sefer Torah which is presently being written. And even those children that have already an ois in the Sefer Torah, however, there are Jewish children who are constantly being born, to see to it that once a boy is past the bris and he has the name, and once a girl was given the name, and the giving of a name has to be at the earliest Kriyas HaTorah possible. So for these newborns, boys and girls, to see to it that they too get an ois in the Sefer Torah for Jewish children that is being written in Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, as well as to see that each and every adult will have an ois in the Sefer Torahs that are being written to unite all of Klal Yisrael. Other issue which is of extreme importance, being that we're getting closer to the summer. Now, summer is a time of vacation in all schools, so it's of extreme importance to see to it that the children who are having vacation from school should be registered into a proper summer program, into a proper day camp or camp for the summer, one that's being run al Pitaras HaKodesh, where the program is run Beruach Shel Yahadus. And this is of extreme importance. Everyone should see to it that wherever one has an influence, to see that the children, even during the year, they are in proper schooling, but to see to it that it is not wasted during the summer, and that during the summer they shall be in a proper environment and in a proper camp which is run properly under proper auspices. Rabbi referred to the famous word from the Baal Shem Tov on the pasuk Isiyu Atem Eretz Chayfetz. There's a pasuk which compares Klal Yisrael to land, and the Baal Shem Tov expressed himself just like we see that land constantly has an unlimited resource of diamonds and of minerals which one can never evaluate the proper value, because we constantly keep on finding more and more in various parcels of land. We keep on discovering more and more value. The very same the Baal Shem Tov said, each and every Yid is compared to a piece of land. That we constantly can discover various values, various hidden values, which until now were hidden and were not revealed and we didn't know about it. Or perhaps the person himself didn't even know about it. And we can discover these values within each and every Yid and bring them about, to bring them about into reality. As far as Pirkei Avos, today is the second Perek. The Mishnah which the Rebbe learned in today's Farbrengen is a Mishnah about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tells us in Perek Beis Mishnah Hey. Mishnah says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai kibel me Hillel v'Shama. Who did Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai learn Torah from? Hillel and Shammai. What does he tell us? Hu haya'ima. Im lamaret Torah harbe. If you have learned a lot of Torah, al tachsek toiv la'atzmecha. Don't hold yourself great. Ki lakach nitzarta. For this reason you were created. In other words, what is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai teaching us here? In Masechta Avos, that a person really has to learn an unlimited amount of Torah. A person has to put himself totally into the learning of Torah. The Rebbe says it's very appropriate for a person like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to give us this lesson, this instruction, because this is what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai resembled in his own life. Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Arboim Shana Lomad, Arboim Shana Limed, for 40 years he learned Torah. For the next 40 years he taught Torah to others. And the third 40 years he was a leader of Klal Yisrael. So Mamela, for a person, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's caliber, it is very appropriate to demand the learning of Torah. Especially in light of what the Tzemach Tzedek explains. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, before he passed away, expressed himself, Eini yedeya be'ezeh derech melichin oisei. I don't know in what way I'm going to be taken. So the Tzemach Tzedek asks, we're talking about a person like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was so great in learning. Where was he all his life? Why didn't he give to this Indian some thought throughout all the years? All the years he didn't say anything. When he was about to pass away, this is when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai expressed, so the Tzemach Tzedek explains, Adarabe, he anisenes. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was so involved in learning, and so involved learning himself, as well as teaching Torah to others, and carrying the burden of leadership, that he never even had a second of time to think about himself, saying, what way am I being taken? However, when it came his last moments, then he already had no other alternative, and that is when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai expressed himself, again we see how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was totally involved into the learning of Torah. Furthermore, during the years of his leadership, he was in the category of an oisik tzorchei tzibur be'emunah. He was involved in tzorchei tzibur with fullest dedication. So al pi halacha he could have been potter from learning Torah. So still we see that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai did not apply this heta to himself, and while he was involved in the highest level of leadership of Klal Yisrael, at the same time he was fully involved into the learning of Torah. So that is why it's very appropriate for a person like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai to instruct us in lamadet Torah harbe al tachzik tova la'atzmecha. Because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is the one that expressed the same philosophy in his own life, the highest dedication to the learning of Torah. We find about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that in the time of the Churban, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai went to the Roman emperor and asked him and begged of him, Ten li Yavne v'chachamer. Give me Yavne and its geniuses and its scholars. It happened to be that in the city of Yavne, that is where the scholars, the Talmidei Chachamim, were situated. So he begged from the Roman emperor that he Ten li Yavne v'chachamer, turn them over to me under my auspices, and don't shepherd them and don't harm them, don't do anything to them, because these people are solely dedicated to the learning of Torah. So again we see that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai expressed through various occasions in his life, he showed the greatness and the appreciation for the learning of Torah. However, the Rebbe added something last week, and added it this week as well, that being that the Mishnah tells us, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai kibel me Hillel v'Shammai, that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai has received from Hillel v'Shammai, So we must say that the teachings of Hillel v'Shammai are also negeya to this hayroya, to this lesson which Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is teaching us in this mission. How? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a disciple of Hillel, as well as a disciple of Shammai. So we find how Hillel was stressing, how Shammai we find in Perek Rishon. Turning back to the first Perek, Mishnah Tezvav, we find how Shammai instructs us, Asei Toiroscha Kva, Amoir Ma'at V'asei Harbe, Ve'avei Mekabel Es Kol Odom B'Seiv Uponim Yofis. So again we see how his Rebbe Shammai also demanded a great dedication to the learning of Torah. Asei Toiroscha Kva, to make sure that your Torah is a kviyas, a very strong kviyas by you, plays a very major role. B'negeya Hillel, we've just learned previously. In the middle of Mishnah Dalet, in the second Perek, it begins with quotations of Hillel. Hillel loy ma'al tifresh min hatzibur. Until we go down in the Mishnah Zayin, we see Kona loy divra Torah, kona loy chayo olam haba. So we see again that Hillel has stressed us and taught us the greatness of divrei Torah. So after having this introduction of Hillel and Shammai, how great and important the learning of Torah is, and these people, Hillel and Shammai, they were the Rebbes of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai went a step further and came to the realization of Im lamadeta Torah harbe al tachzik tova latzmecha ki lakach netzorta. Rebbe asked, obviously it's a little question arises, we learn in the Mishnah, Kana loy divra Torah, Kana loy chaya olam haba, that for learning Torah, one is rewarded with chaya olam haba. Here Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is telling us that if you've learned a lot of Torah, don't consider yourself any great, because this is what you were created for. So if that's the case, we are supposed to learn Torah without seeking any special kind of reward. Not because of olam haba. One is supposed to learn Torah because lekach nitzarta. This is why a person was created, for the learning of Torah. This is our neshama shlichus, to learn Torah. And here, a few lines earlier, Hillel is telling us, Kana loy divra Torah, kana loy chaya olam haba. As the Rebbe explained, that by using the expression olam haba, it can refer to two types of inyanim. Olam haba can mean the world to come. World to come meaning Gan Eden. In other words, after a person has lived alei adomos, and a person comes to Yenevelt, there's an inyan of Gan Eden, and Gan Eden then means a reward. It's a spiritual reward for the mitzvahs and ma'asim tovim which a person did on this world. However, there's another inyan of olam haba. Olam haba meaning the world to come when Mashiach will come. This also means olam haba. When Mashiach will come, the learning of Torah will be in a completely different level. It'll be in a much higher level, as explained in Chassidus. Memela, when the Mishnah here is talking, Kana loy divrei Torah, Kana loy chaya olam haba, the Mishnah doesn't mean olam haba in the sense of the world to come, in the sense of Gan Eden. Gan Eden coming as a schar for learning Torah, because here we are demanding from a person that he should learn Torah not because of any schar. Here Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is coming right away in the next Mishnah and telling us, Kibel mehil v'shamai, im lomadet Torah harbe, al tachzik tova latzmecha, ki lokach netzarta. This is what a person was created for. However, what is the pshat in the Mishnah? Kana loy divrei Torah, kana loy chaya olam haba. The pshat is olam haba, the level of Torah. If a person learns Torah, he will come to a higher level of Torah, which is the level of Torah which will be olam haba with the coming of Mashiach. Of course, the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also referred to that tonight, Beis Iyar is Teferes Shebeteferes, and this is the Yom HaLedes, the birthday of the Rebbe Maharash. And it's also the day that the Rebbe founded Tazria-Metzora Chabad. It's celebrated on this day, on the day of Teferes Shebeteferes. And there's a Malav Malka tonight in 770 by Tazria-Metzora Chabad, which the Rebbe asked to announce in the Farbrengen. And the Rebbe said he hopes that all of generally, in Yonim, in Kedusha, have to be performed in a manner of Kol Chelev LaHashem. The Rambam paskins that any inyan of LaHashem, any inyan of Kedusha, has to be in a way that kol chelev, all the best, has to give into kedusha. Has to be given to kedusha. Whenever we perform a mitzvah, whenever we perform an inyan shel kedusha, we have to do it with the top priority, with the best, with the elite. Memela, this is, the Rebbe says, corresponds very strongly to the thought of Teferes Shebetiferes. Teferes Shebetiferes in Sfiras, also meaning the beauty of beauties. The Rebbe says that he hopes that all the inyanim of Afatzas HaMayonis and Afatzas HaYadus, which is all part of Tzich HaGudas Chabad, will all be performed in a proper manner, as the Rebbe, which is suitable to this day, in a way of Teferes Shebetiferes, and keeping in mind the instruction of the Rebbe Marash. The Rebbe Marash has expressed himself that in all the inyanim of Kedusha, and all inyanim, a Yid has to go in a manner of lekatchila ariba. The Marash used the Yiddish expression. He said, "The Welt sagt, the world says, am mekenish darunter geht man ariba. If we can't go down, then we go over." However, the Rebbe Marash said, "When ich sag," and he said that in all inyanim we have to approach lekatchila ariba. We have to take everything with in a very broadened manner. And the Rebbe keeps on constantly referring to this lesson of the Rebbe Marash, how in all inyanim of kedusha we have to approach it very broadly in a format of lekatchila ariba. Talking of the Rebbe Marash, somewhere in the course of today's Farbrengen, I don't recall the moment where, if somebody does, Ada Rebbe, please mention it, the Rebbe referred to a saying of the Rebbe Marash that parnasa of a Yid today, the Rebbe Marash said, is like man. Just like when the Yidden were in the Midbar, the Rebbe fed them with man. Same thing today, though we know that there's an inyan of Verachacha Hashem Elokecha b'chol ashatase, that whatever we do, the Rebbe blesses us and puts bracha into our doing. Memela, we should be able to have parnasa properly and sustain ourselves and our families. However, the Rebbe Marash added, we still have to come on. It still comes across in a format of man, that the Rebbe has to perform miracles, just like the man in the midbar was Alechem in Hashemayim. The very same, our parnasa today is also in a format together with the Rebbe's bracha, but we still have to come on to an inyan of man. Another inyan which the Rebbe spoke about very, very strongly and very warm is tomorrow's celebration of the Siyum of Tanya. Second, we'll get to that. We all know that Rabbi Weinberg is learning Tanya on the radio for the past 22 years. And it is now that he's up to the final siyum of the Sefer Tanya. The Rebbe gave it very, very warm attention, and the Rebbe said that Bechlal, when we're talking about a new invention and a new idea, as we'll be talking about radio, there's a tremendous thing to it, that one could be learning here or saying something here, and it is heard not only in the immediate vicinity, or not only in a close-by vicinity, but it could be heard at a very distant place simultaneously. While the person is saying this inyan here, it is carried and it is heard in a distant place. One can at the same time be zech mishtatef in this shiur, in this inyan that is being learned over the radio. And when we're talking about inventions and creation, new ideas which are being introduced, the Rebbe says naturally it is all because that these inyanim should be able to be utilized for Kedusha, for the learning of Tanya, for spreading of Yiddishkeit and Chasidus. Because otherwise the Rebbe wouldn't go ahead and create something new and introduce something new in the world. There inyanim ha'asurim, there are things which we are prohibited to hear that are also being played over the air, over the radio, because naturally the Rebbe is not taking away the koyach of prira from us. We still have our freedom of choice, what we want to do. But the ikar reason why the Rebbe created it, and why the Rebbe created these type of things, is naturally only because that in Yonim of Torah and Yahadus, which this is another step in the Hafatzas HaMayonis, in the spreading of Mayonis Achsidus, which is another step bringing closer to the Ka'asimah, to the coming of Mashiach. This is being done through this inyan of radio. And the Rebbe at the same time also said that it should be announced that tomorrow afternoon this siyum on radio, on Tanya over the radio, will be taking place at Eastern Parkway in the hall in 667 Eastern Parkway. This was announced again at the Farbrengen. And the Rebbe in today's Farbrengen also made a siyum on the Sefer Tanya. And as it is customary that when a siyum is made, right away, as we say in the expression Simchas Torah, when we are Messiah Torah, in the Rishus, before Chasam Bereishis, we express ourselves that what we will do is we will finish and renew again at the same time. That is why when we finish Torah and Simchas Torah, we finish with Zois HaBracha, and we right away begin again with Bereishis. Same thing. Completion of the Sefer HaTanya Siyum is made. However, at the same time, the Rebbe also began learning the Tanya for the second cycle, which the Tanya is going to be learned over the radio. The Rebbe stellt sich an the Alter Rebbe's last words. It was quite a lengthy Siyum and a very in-depth Siyum. But just to go over very briefly some of the Nekudas, the very last words in the Kunteres Achen are Kizel Umas Zev Chulhu. The Alter Rebbe at the very end of Kunteres Achen talks about the observing of Shabbos. And the Alter Rebbe explains that there's the Gashmiistic observing of Shabbos. However, there's a spiritual observing of Shabbos. There's a Pnimiistic inyan in Shabbos as well. And there's the inyan of observing Shabbos al pi halacha. However, the fact that Shabbos is an appropriate day when we associate ourselves with the Eibishter, and it's a day, the Alter Rebbe uses the expression "L'dafka b'havaya echad," to get associated with the Eibishter. This is the spiritual observance of the Shabbos. The Alter Rebbe goes on saying that there is Zocher v'Shomer, and just like it is in Gashmius, it is in Ruchnius. And he uses the expression Kizelu umas zeh chulu. The Eibishter created one against the other. The Eibishter created it in Gashmius as well as the Eibishter created it in Ruchnius. So the Rebbe asked that the Alter Rebbe is explaining in Sefer Tanya. Rebbe added on that Kunteres Achen, these are various letters which the Alter Rebbe wrote. However, it was put at the end of the Tanya not by the Alter Rebbe himself, but by the sons of the Alter Rebbe, the children of the Alter Rebbe. They arranged the Seder in the Tanya, and this last chelik of Kunteres Achen they put at the very end. So that definitely deserves chshivas because it's the Alter Rebbe's children who have put it here, and the writings is of the Alter Rebbe, and it finishes with the word Zelu Masechul. So the Rebbe asked, in the Sefer Tanya, the Alter Rebbe explains that the way the Rebbe is created in Yonim in the world is created in a way that Gashmias is nishtalshel me Ruchnias. In other words, it's created first in Ruchnias in the spiritual sense. As a result of it being so spiritually, it comes down physically the same way. And here, obviously, the Alter Rebbe says different. It's not the idea of Zelu Maseh. It's different, completely different approach. It should have been in a format of Zeh Nishtalshel Mezeh. The Ruchnias the Gashmias comes from the Ruchnias. There's the inyan of Shmira Shabbos and Ruchnias. Zocher v'Shomer and the Pnimis in Yonim, spiritually. And then we have the Zocher v'Shomer physically, which comes as a result how it stands spiritually. The Rebbe also asked, what is the Alter Rebbe referring to with the Chulhu? Every word is extremely accurate by the Alter Rebbe, and he must be referring to something. The Rebbe also spoke about the beginning of the Tanya, and as we know, the Sharblat, which is the introduction to the Tanya, the cover page of the Tanya, was also written by the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe uses the expression on the cover page, Ki korev elecha hadava miyoid beficho belvavcha la'asaysay, that which is a quotation of a pasuk. Levaya hatev, to explain well, eichu korev miyoid, how is it that close? Bederech arucha k'tzara, to explain it in a long and short way. The Rebbe said that this expression, long and short, is taken from an expression in Gemara. This whole story in Gemara, how one of the Tanoim was going on a trip, and this particular Tane did not know directions, and he inquired directions. So he was taught a shortcut. However, when he started following this direction, he wasn't able to follow it. There were various obstacles in the way. So that is why he had to go the same way. He couldn't use the derech tzara, he had to use the derech arucha. Rebbe said that the source of this expression, where do we find this type of an expression? It's this Ma'is in Gemara, where we find that there are certain inyanim that at times we can come to the same minyan through a short way, and at times we can come to it through a longer way. What is the main inyan what Alter Rebbe is out to explain in the Sefer HaTanya? The idea of emunah in the Rebishter. This is the pasuk that he quotes, Ki korev elecha hadava miyoid beficho belvavcha la'asaysay. What is hadava? What is the thing that is that close to us? What is the pasuk referring to? Emunah. What's the pshat that there's a derech harucha and there's a derech k'tzara? Rebbe explained, just going to go over very briefly the Nekudas, that there is a munah, how it could stand very makiftik in a person, a very general feeling of a munah. However, the person isn't really penetrated with a munah. The Rebbe brought in as an example the famous Gemara. There's a Gemara that tells us, Ganva pum machtarte rachmone karye, that when a Ganev goes to steal, he begs from the Rebishter that he should succeed. He's doing something which is completely contrary to the will of the Rebishter. The Rebishter is forbidden stealing. However, the Ganev knows that there's an idea of emunah. He knows that he believes in the Rebishter, and he also has this emunah within him. However, the emunah has not taken him over fully to such an extent that he should realize that what he's doing is contrary to the Rebishter's will. Memela, we can have emunah, but it's b'derech tzara, it's a very brief way, it's very makifdik, just taking the person on a very external way. It's not really becoming part and parcel of the person. However, the Alter Rebbe is saying what he's trying to do with the Sefer HaTanya is that emunah should be not only b'derech tzara, but b'derech harucha, to get to it at a long way, meaning that the person should get it not just in an external manner, but the person should be fully covered. It should penetrate into the person, that the person should be in ganzen durchgenommen with the proper understanding of emunah, that the inyan of kikare ve'elecha adova miyoid should be close to him. Beficha b'lvavcha ad la'asoisei. What's beficha b'lvavcha la'asoisei? This is the three categories of machshava, dibur, and ma'aseh. That the machshava, dibur, and ma'aseh of a person, which these are the three levushim of a person, should be fully durchgenommen, should be fully absorbed through and through with the idea of emunah. And this is what the whole Sefer HaTanya is all about. The Rebbe again referred that when we're learning Tanya, we're learning Tanya ourselves, as well as learning Tanya with other people, as the Alter Rebbe concludes at the end. Zeh le'umas zeh chulu. What's the pshat chulu? Chulu is already meaning to the other people. The other people, the people who we are teaching the Tanya to. That the spreading of the Tanya, the teaching of the Tanya should be with such an effect that the person who is learning Tanya, in the meantime he's learning Tanya only in the Pchinas Mekabel, he's only a Talmud learning Tanya, should become a Teifeach al menas lahatfiach, as the expression goes. He should be that wet that he should be able to wet others as well. He should be able to carry over the knowledge and wisdom which he's being taught in the Tanya, should be able to relate this and bring the words of the Tanya to other Yidden, and so on and so forth. This is the chulu which Alter Rebbe finishes off, the very last words at the Kunter Sachen, meaning the chulu, to keep on reaching to more and more people. Briefly, in the course of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe also learned a Rashi. However, the Rebbe did not learn a Rashi in the inside. The Rebbe learned an Inyan, raised a question which obviously would require Rashi's comment, and it's something which is very obvious, and when we look in the Psukim, we see that Rashi bypasses it and does not say anything. And based on the klal, that Rashi's Inyan is lafarish aniloi basi ela lafarish pshuta shel mikra. Rashi's Inyan is to keep on stressing wherever there's something which is not understood in pshat, Rashi has to teach it to us. And here we have two obvious questions, and Rashi passes and does not say anything. First question is in Kapitel Yud Gimel Pasuk Tes. After the Pasuk has already spoken for 8 psukim about tzaras, there's a new Pasuk. Nega tzaras kisiya ba'adam. If a person will be plagued with a tzaras, v'huva ala kohen, he should be brought to the kohen. Obviously, this is nothing new. We have learned about it for the past 8 psukim. We've been learning about nega tzaras. So here comes such a question, which is, the child who's learning Chumash is bothered with the question, well, why does the pasuk begin with something new? Nega tzaras, kisiya ba'adam. If a person will be plagued with a tzaras, v'huva ala kohen, he has to go to the kohen. We're not into the introduction now of Pashas Negoyim. The introduction of Pashas Negoyim already began several psukim ago. That is one question which the Rebbe asked. Another question is Pasuk Yud Gimel. Pasuk Yud Gimel says, "V'roa hakoyin," the koyin will see the person. V'nekisas ha'tzaras es kol psori. He was covered with tzaras on his entire body. V'tiyar es hanega, kuloi hofach lovan toich. Here the person is pure. Why? Because the entire body has turned like extra white. And this is something the Rebbe says which requires a tremendous comment from Rashi. If he has a plague, if he has a nega on part of his body, we say that he's tummy. Here, when he becomes kulei hafach lavan, his entire body becomes hafach lavan, he's tar. This is something which is contradictory. So other mefarshim, not Rashi, other mefarshim, the Rebbe says, make a big issue with this pasuk, and they base on this pasuk a complete philosophy. They claim that based on this pasuk, we must say that the whole inyan of Negoyim, of the Pasha of Negoyim, which we are learning about in this Sedre, is a chukah. Is something which we cannot understand with our understanding, with our knowledge. Why? Because of this question. Because if the person is plagued partially, we say he's tamei. Excuse me. And in the event when the person is kulei hafach lavan, then we say toil. So based on this shaila, they come to a conclusion that we must say that the whole inyan of Negoyim is a chukah. And Rashi, throughout Chumash, we do not find these words that Rashi should say that it's an inyan of choik, the inyan of Negoyim. So obviously, where Rashi talks about chukim, and Rashi does give various examples of mitzvahs which can be categorized as a chukah, Rashi does not use the expression that Negoyim, the mitzvah of Negoyim, is categorized as a chukah. So we see that Rashi Taka doesn't hold that way. So if Rashi doesn't agree with what the other mefarshim say, still the question arises, why doesn't Rashi here comment anything on this pasuk? So the way the Rebbe learned that we see it here in Pasuk Yud Gimel, as well as we see Vayt on the Psukim, that this is a new concept. Rashi goes with a shitteh, not the pshat that Negoyim is a chukah. Negoyim is not a chukah. Why is this person here tahir? Because the fact that when he's plagued with his entire body, that his entire body becomes like an extra white, kulei hafach lavan, this is a siman, this in itself is an indication that he is not a Metzora. Why does he have a special whiteness? Because a Metzora has to be that it should be on part of the body. Here when he's covered on his entire body, and in what sense? How is the coverage? That kulei hafach lavan, everything is turning about extra lavan. If it's turning about extra lavan, this is a siman that this is a different type of a person. He's a person, Rabbi used the expression, just like a person can be black, the same way a person can be extra white. And Memela, it has no shaykhs to Negoyim, so that's why there's no inyan for Rashi to comment on it. And it definitely does not show that Negoyim has a shaykhs with chukim, nothing whatsoever. On the contrary, it can be understood very well and very simple. It can be understood to such an extent that the child even understands it as well. The child understands that when kisses hatzaras is kolpsori and tieres hanega kuloi hafach lovan, the entire body of the person came about to be lovan, an extra amount of lovan, more lovan than the person's body is usual. And this is not on a part of his body. This is on the entire part of the body. So the child also understands that it's something which has no shaykhs to Negoyim, and that is why it's so simple, it's so obvious that there's no need for Rashi to explain anything. It's very well B'negeya Pasuk Tes, where the Pasuk begins, Nega tzaras kisiya ba'odam v'huva ala koyin. And this is something which sounds like a new introduction of a new type of an inyan of Nega. Rabbi says, let us look weiter. We look weiter to Pasuk Yud and to Pasuk Yud Aleph. Pasuk Yud Aleph goes on explaining that this is a new type of a makkah. Tzaras noshenasi b'yu b'soroi v'timoy hakoyin lo yaskirenu kitamehu. So Rashi explains, makkah yeshenahi tachas hamichya. In other words, this is a double type of a makkah. Under his wound, he has his tzaras. The Mela, this pasuk taka does not come as an introduction to the general concept of nega tzaras kisiya ba'adam v'huva ala koyin. Nega tzaras, the Torah began talking about taka a few psukim earlier. This pasuk does not come as an introduction to the general idea of nega tzaras. This pasuk comes as an introduction to the specific tzaras which we are talking about here. And this is like a new type of a tzaras, something which the Torah did not talk about till now. This is a type of a tzaras where the person has a wound, and under the wound he has his nega tzaras. Memela, there's no need for Rashi to comment here in pasuk Tes why the pasuk begins with a new type of an introduction. It's not a new type of an introduction. It's a pasuk that comes behemshech to the next couple of psukim. And as the child is dwelling in to learn a couple of psukim, it becomes self-explanatory to him to such an extent that Rashi Taka doesn't have to say anything. As well as in Pasuk Yud Gimel and Pasuk Yud Dalet and those psukim, where it's kulei hafach lavan, there's also no need for Rashi to explain anything. Why? Because it's also self-understood to the child who's learning, that realizes that this is no inyan of tzaras, this is an inyan that has no shaykhs to the inyan of tzaras, it's an extra whiteness that the person possesses. The harayit covers his entire body. He's a simon, this person has something within him that his entire body is extra white, and it has no shaykhs to the inyan of tzaras. To such an extent, and it's so simple for the child who's learning Chumash as well, the Ben Chumash Lamikra, that Rashi Taka doesn't have to add any type of explanation.